Hi, everyone. I'm Charles Sennott. I'm the founder of the GroundTruth Project, which is very proud to be serving as a partner to UMass and the History Department in creating this year-long public history project. And this is our concluding panel. So I really want to thank you all for attending. I especially want to thank Dan Ellsberg and Ed Snowden. That was an historic and powerfully important and relevant conversation. Ed said, whistleblowing is the last safeguard of democracy. So we are going to conclude the conference with this panel and try to really bring it home along that theme of whistleblowing as a safeguard for democracy, talk about truth and dissent. And we're going to be doing that by talking to top journalists and analysts about today's forever wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, the list is long. And we seem to be living in an era of perpetual war, countless U.S. military interventions, despite repeated failures to achieve even the stated objectives. So how did we get here? What are the lessons learned? Maybe more importantly, lessons not learned from Vietnam. I'd like to create a conversation today that's bookended by the role truth, dissent, and Dan Ellsberg's release of the Pentagon Papers played in ending the war in Vietnam. And then by asking the hard questions of the present regarding the war in Afghanistan and other examples of the forever wars, as we slouch toward the end of the war in Afghanistan, where's the truth? Where's the dissent against this war? How will it all end? So today we're going to hear from leading journalists, scholars, including a political scientist. And I'm going to briefly say who they are and then come into a lightning round with them. But just briefly, there's Neta Crawford, who's co-director of the Costs of War Project, Azmat Khan, investigative journalist and professor, Nick Turse, war reporter and author, and Craig Whitlock, the Washington Post journalist who broke the Afghanistan Papers story. So we'll do a lightning round for each of the panelists. I'm going to ask them each to hit hard and fast on a note that compares their work to Vietnam. So sort of looking at today's forever wars and how we might think of them in relation to Vietnam. Before we get underway, I just want to give a quick grounding in my own experience with war. Before I founded GroundTruth, I was a journalist in the field, a war correspondent. I covered the war in Afghanistan and Iraq for the Boston Globe, where I was the Middle East bureau chief. On September 19th, 2001, I was among the first reporters to land in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks. And since then, I've still been covering Afghanistan and Iraq and many other countries in the Middle East. So, okay, the lightning round. I'm going to ask you all to try to stick to a 2-minute take, knowing that we will circle back to deeper questions and work toward really bringing home the themes of truth and dissent and Dan Ellsberg's legacy. Neta Crawford, I wanted to start with you. I want to just briefly say you're a Boston University professor of political science, co-director of the Costs of War Project. And I wanted to ask you to start with the costs of war. Can you give us some sense of how we think of the costs of the war in Vietnam in comparison to the costs of the war in Afghanistan? There's real costs, trillions of dollars, and there are the costs of borrowing for wars leveraged on debt. And there are, of course, the moral costs, which you calculate very well as well. So how would you begin to help us wrap our arms around the enormity of the costs of these forever wars unfolding now compared to the war in Vietnam?
Right. The way to think about the cost of any war is to think about what Congress appropriates for the wars directly. And that, in the case of Vietnam, was in current dollars back then about 111 billion. And if we think about it in terms of constant dollars, today it would be about 738 billion for just the appropriations for the DoD. But there are obviously more costs. And again, just sticking with the dollars, you can think about the way that the Pentagon budget grows when you're at war. Not the war budget itself, but the things around the Pentagon, like the cost of paying personnel more or health insurance for wounded or injured individuals. Okay, so that's the Pentagon base budget grows. And another cost is associated with how you pay for the wars. The Vietnam War was paid for by taxes and by people buying bonds. And there was some borrowing really against other parts of the government, but mostly it was paid for with cash. In the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States went into deficit in 2001 and hasn't come out. And we've been borrowing to pay for these wars. So we have to pay interest on the borrowing to pay for the DoD part of it. Then there are costs associated with the State Department and any reconstruction. But the big tail end cost, the cost that we often don't think about, is the cost of caring for veterans. And that $111 billion that I mentioned for Vietnam does not include the cost for veterans care. Even then, shortly after the war ended, and then in terms of the fact that we're not done paying yet for the peak cost of Vietnam veterans. And we will not be done paying for the peak cost of the post 9/11 war veterans until about 40 or 50 years from now. And then there are other costs as well. I could get into the human costs, but I see you want to move on.
Well, no, I think those are going to be really important, but I might suggest we return to those in a deeper way, because the human costs are the costs that we all need to care the most about. So I will circle back to that if that's okay. Nick Turse, I wanted to go to you next. I wanted you to just sort of talk about your own history and the research and the investigative reporting you've done. Your book, Kill Anything That Moves, came out in 2013. It's incredibly powerful. An investigation into the history of the killing of innocent civilians in Vietnam. And I think what's impressive is you've continued your work looking at the killing of civilians and the U.S. military's drone strategy, specifically the policy of assassination in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen. So, Nick, I wanted to ask your perception of the killing of civilians and try to help us quantify how we might think about the killing of civilians in Vietnam compared to Afghanistan. How has the U.S. changed, and how is it still repeating the same failings and atrocities of the past?
Thanks so much, Charlie. It's a real honor to be here on this panel. I think there are some major differences when you talk about the current wars. When you look at Afghanistan against Vietnam, the amount of firepower that was used in Vietnam was overwhelming. I mean, a tremendous amount of artillery, airstrikes, carpet bombing that we haven't seen on the same scale in Afghanistan. So I don't think we've seen the mass killing to the extent. The number of civilians killed, during our time fighting in Southeast Asia, just in South Vietnam, about 3 million. We haven't seen, that tremendous loss of life, but we know that civilians have been consistently harmed over this war, and I think in some ways it may even be more hidden from us today. I think there was a greater realization of the civilian costs during the Vietnam War because of a lot of things that we've heard about earlier in this conference, the anti-war movement bringing it to the fore. So while we might have a more circumscribed air war, somewhat more precise, on some fronts, say in Somalia with drone strikes, this is still an ever-present problem and something that the government has endeavored to keep secret. And we haven't been able to get at it in the same ways. I think with a Pentagon Papers type of document dump, we haven't had that for the current conflicts in the same way.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nick. Azmat Khan is up next. Azmat is a colleague who I had the pleasure to work with in the field, covering the Arab Spring when we were both working with PBS Frontline. Azmat's work in many powerful ways runs in the same direction as Nick. It highlights the use of drones by the U.S. military in Afghanistan and Iraq. The piece she did for the New York Times Magazine in 2017, The Uncounted, is extraordinary. It's so worth going back and reading. Azmat's really broken new ground on revealing how many civilians are dying in what the U.S. likes to call precision wars and through the use of drones. So Azmat, I wanted to ask you about that sort of a brief analysis of the landscape to the extent you might have looked at the air wars in Vietnam versus these so-called precise wars in Afghanistan, and really target in, so to speak, on your findings around the use of drones.
Sure. So just off the bat, I think it's helpful to sort of define how much of this is actually drone strikes and how much is traditional air power. And I think that in the Obama era, we've started to call this a drone war. But in actuality, if you were to break down the percentages, we're looking at about 3% of the airstrikes in this era of reducing troops and shifting to air power are actually exclusively drone strikes. The remainder are often carried out maybe with the assistance of drones. So there might be drones that are doing reconnaissance or surveillance. But a lot of this can be traditional aircraft. And so just to sort of ground this, my work has been looking at this era of the shift to primarily conducting American wars via the air and often traditional aircrafts, and investigating what's actually happening on the ground and what we've been told. So, for example, in Iraq and Syria, you see that there are claims by the US military about how precise these weapons are. And, I had started to look at what those claims were and to see if it was possible to go on the ground in Iraq and to try to do a ground sample. And so the ground sample that Charlie mentioned that I'd done in the New York Times Magazine looked at a sample of 103 airstrikes. And what I found was that 1 in 5 resulted in a civilian death, which was a rate that was 31 times higher than the government claimed. Now, in the time since, I've had the opportunity to investigate more airstrikes in other countries. And yes, some of them are drone strikes, for example, in Pakistan. But in Afghanistan and Syria, a lot of these are larger, different kinds of weapons, including B-52s. And to just really solidify and very succinctly say what I'm finding is that the human costs of war have shifted. US soldiers, service members are dying at some of the lowest rates that they have traditionally in history. And the human costs of war are primarily being shifted to both foreign civilians and partner forces. And so this shift to air power has really taken away some of the political costs that in the past, for example, during the era of Vietnam, have served to curtail war or to mount pressure to end it. So we're really looking at an era of warfare in which the political costs are diminished significantly, and those result in far less attention and focus than there would be on wars as in years past.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Azmat. Craig Whitlock, you're up next. Craig, as I said, is with the Washington Post, and Craig broke the story of the Afghanistan Papers. And he did so the old-fashioned way, I guess, an extensive Freedom of Information Act request, really a campaign over, I think it was several years, Craig. And his reporting forced the military to release about 400 interviews with key officials involved in the war. And we caught, through those interviews, you catch a candid glimpse of their assessment of what went wrong. And I think come away realizing they never really thought it was winnable, at least not with the objectives the way they were set out. Tremendous ignorance about the country itself, and really a devastating indictment of our own military and its strategy or lack of in Afghanistan. So, Craig, just tell us about the Afghanistan Papers and perhaps compare them to the Pentagon Papers. This is the 50th anniversary year of the release of the Pentagon Papers. That's the point of the conference, but very different wars, very different documents. But what are the historic parallels that we might draw from both?
Yeah, it's important to make clear there are some very strong parallels and similarities in the documents, but some real fundamental differences too. As people in the conference have heard time and again, the Pentagon Papers was a secret history of the war that was written within the Defense Department by people who were assigned by Robert McNamara to draw up this history of Vietnam. And it was all drawn on documents. It was drawn on memos. It was drawn on diplomatic cables. They weren't allowed to interview people. So it was this history, but it was all based on documents because they wanted to keep it secret. They didn't want word to get out. At least that was McNamara's orders, I believe. The Afghanistan Papers was the flip version of this. This was a federal agency called the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. It's kind of a mouthful, but it's essentially an Inspector General's office that was created by Congress to make sure that there was no fraud, waste, or abuse with all the billions and billions of dollars being spent in Afghanistan. But starting in 2014, this agency decided to do a study called Lessons Learned to try and assess the mistakes made during the war to make sure it wouldn't happen again in the future. And at the time in 2014, the thinking was we were pulling out of Afghanistan. President Obama had declared an end to combat operations. He had promised to withdraw all troops by the end of his term. So the Inspector General's office started interviewing hundreds of people who had played some role in the war. So their history was all based on interviews. These are essentially mini oral histories and notes and transcripts from generals and diplomats and aid workers assessing what went wrong from their perspective in the war. But the agency really, they published some public reports based on these interviews, but they didn't quote anybody. All the really striking and powerful admissions of what went wrong was watered down or omitted, and it took the Washington Post 3 years with FOIA lawsuits to pry these loose. And as you said, Charlie, what they show really was the astonishing frank admissions by people in charge of the war that they didn't have a strategy. They didn't know what they were doing. They had a fundamental ignorance of Afghanistan, and just hearing their voices, we actually had some audio tapes of these interviews, or reading what was said in print was really striking. And I think people knew the war wasn't going well, but they didn't realize just how screwed up it had been for 2 decades. And that was in essence what the Afghanistan Papers revealed to the country.
Thanks, Craig. It's really an amazing body of work, huge service. And I want to come back now to this theme that's really coming forward around air war. It was really interesting to hear Dan talk about how Nixon escalated the air war in 1974 in his talk. He mentioned this, and I just think, God, is that the lesson that was learned from Vietnam? Fight the war from the air, minimize casualties to U.S. troops, don't have a draft, and just bombard people from on high, as happened in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. So this gets us to the human costs of war. And Neta, I'd love to come back to you and really hear your assessment of these human costs that have come with this shift in strategy toward a more intensified air war. How do you see that? How do you see the current moment in these forever wars? What is the human toll?
Well, the human toll has to be divided in two, really. It's the direct deaths that Azmat was talking about, people killed directly by bombs, bullets, and fire. And then there's the indirect death, which is the consequence of the destruction of infrastructure. And in every war, during and after the war, there's indirect death that we don't usually put in the calculus. And then there are all the people who are displaced. So, and then, in other locations, either internally displaced in the country or outside the country. So on the question of bombing, though, I think that what happened is that the theory in the Vietnam War was that you could bomb the Vietnamese into submission. And that was tried and tried. It was also the theory in World War II. It was the theory in Korea. And it was the theory in World War I, right? This is a common notion that you can bomb people to submission. And in counterinsurgencies, what you're trying to do is separate the people, separate the fish from the water. That is, separate the soldiers, as Mao said, from the people and their support. And that's the theory here, right? The theory here is, but the difference is we're not deliberately targeting areas where we know civilians are. And most of the deaths are inadvertent, unintended, except for the massacres, right? So another difference between Vietnam and today is that we don't accept massacres in the way that we did, or we sort of say that it's the individual soldier's fault. They're a bad apple or they're a mad apple. But what we see right now is hundreds of thousands of people killed in direct death, and then many more. We don't actually know how many people have died indirectly in Afghanistan and Pakistan, because of course the war has also been in Pakistan.
What did this human cost of the war look like to you, Azmat, and then you, Nick, from the ground, the reporting you've done really on the ground rather, in places that have been impacted by these airstrikes and by drone strikes, and you've had a chance to really put a human face on that. Azmat, do you want to start it off, and then Nick, I'd like to turn to you and maybe even talk about some of the other places other than Afghanistan where you've seen this. Azmat?
Right, sure. So, looking at the era, just focusing, for example, on the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, I think it's a little bit different. The civilian experience can be a little bit different because in so many ways, many of the people who found themselves casualties of US air power were also casualties of ISIS in different ways. And it was a very complicated dynamic for many of these people who had ideas about what American air power was like. I remember sitting with somebody who told me once, I had this idea that US air power, with all of their technology, I could hold this teacup and they could do a strike and just hit the teacup in my hand. And I couldn't believe what happened to me. And I've met so many survivors of airstrikes or people who've lost family members in airstrikes in some of these wars, including in Afghanistan, who were really confused because in their cases, and sometimes there was nobody who was ISIS living nearby or next door, and they didn't understand what had happened and why they were hit. They had this idea that the United States doesn't just have amazing technological and precision capabilities, that they have intelligence. And so I met families who couldn't piece together what had happened. And oftentimes they weren't left with just these deaths, but they were left with also injuries that were permanent disabilities. Some of the families that I've known now for years, there's one who right now, it's a young boy. He and his father were some of the lone survivors of this airstrike that killed many of their relatives. This boy, who hasn't been able to get adequate medical treatment now for 3.5 years, he's been going to Jordan, is about to probably have his leg amputated because of this airstrike. And the United States has not been making the kinds of payments that they had in the past, which are known as condolence payments. They're not compensation, but they're the kinds of payments that the United States first started making really during the Korean War and during ground forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. These payments really ramped up as part of counterinsurgency strategy to try to win over hearts and minds. And those kinds of payments aren't happening now. So the civilians that I'm meeting, to kind of put a human face on this, they're people who are at a loss for understanding, at least when it's a case of intelligence failure or poor or outdated intelligence, they're at a loss for understanding why they were targeted, and that's one of the things they want to know most, or why they were hit. It's not clear. I'm not saying that the US military is deliberately targeting civilians. I'm not saying that. What they don't understand is why they were hit, why their cases often haven't been acknowledged, and how there's no means for them. Many of them just want an apology and some kind of offer of something to help them. And for example, in Iraq, the Iraqi compensation scheme is something that is incredibly bureaucratic. If you were trying to get paid through your own government in that case, it could take as long as a decade in some cases to get paid through that. So these are people who really don't have advocates for them, even organizations that maybe in past wars had represented them on the ground or with the US military. There is no organization that now, I as a journalist, I'm not an advocate, I can't act in that role. But there isn't an organization even that I can refer them to as somebody who might help them in these situations. So we're essentially looking at, to kind of just to draw a parallel back to what I was saying earlier, which is when you've taken the political costs, some of the biggest political costs of America's ground wars, that the kinds of costs we saw in the early aughts, the costs of detention and not knowing, the failures of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, when you take that out of the picture, where the United States is no longer detaining people en masse, we've now outsourced that to our foreign partners. They're doing that detention. When you remove ground troops to the smallest numbers possible, you're looking at American deaths, service member deaths, as much smaller. So for example, in Afghanistan, in Operation Freedom Sentinel, you're looking at, I think, 64 deaths of US service members. In the US war against ISIS, you're 64 that were the result of combat. In Iraq and Syria, the war against ISIS, you're looking at 21 deaths in combat. These are very small numbers. So you're now taking away the political costs of when Americans get really riled up about war, which is when US service members are dying. You're starting to reduce that. And so what's ending up as a result is that the human costs of war are being shifted to these civilians that we're talking about. But because you've now reduced, and it's a wonderful thing that US service members are dying at lower rates, but you've now also then reduced the kind of focus and attention that these wars get. And the kind of media coverage when newspapers when investigations in particular, the kinds of focus that they often do on these wars is when there are American troops on the ground or when American soldiers are losing their lives, often results in the greatest amount of coverage. So we're essentially looking at civilians facing much of the human costs of these wars and a fraction of the kind of attention or accountability or even pressure to end wars than we've seen in the past.
Nick, what did you see on the ground? How would you calculate that, and how would you help us understand it?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Azmat just said. You know, when I've done some reporting recently on victims of strikes in Yemen, and people there had the same type of idea that the United States had exceptionally precise air power, and they couldn't figure out how it was that this high technology proved to be so faulty. You know, there was I profiled two large intermarried extended families. You know, over 7 separate attacks by the United States, 6 drone strikes and 1 raid in Yemen. 36 members of this family were killed. A quarter of them were children between the ages of 3 months and 14 years old. The families lost loved ones, homes, livestock, neighbors, and you know there were another 12 people who were not family members who were killed in these strikes. And you know, U.S. government authorities have consistently claimed throughout the years that their targets were terrorists, but outside investigators and the families have consistently said that this is untrue. And while it's been 7 years since the first strike, they still haven't received any answers, and that's what they want. You know, they want. You know, they want to live their lives without this constant state of fear. In January, these families filed a petition against the U.S. government through the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is an arm of the Organization of American States that investigates human rights conditions in the Western Hemisphere. And the families presented a 50-page dossier of evidence. And what they're seeking are what's called precautionary measures. Effectively, they're asking for an injunction against assassination. The case probably won't be acted on for several years, maybe 5 years or more. And I don't have much hope that this is going to hold the U.S. government to heel. But this is how desperate this family is. All they're saying is, show us the secret evidence that we're terrorists, and allow us to present evidence that we're not. They're saying, we're just people. Most of the people you've killed are children. You need to stop this. You need to be upfront with the evidence. And there's no Pentagon Papers for these people. There's no way to see the basis for the war that's been conducted on these two families. And one other aspect of this that I think is important is the psychological trauma that comes with all this. People have been living with the idea that the other shoe is going to drop, that a missile is going to come out of the sky, for a decade or more. That at any time this can happen. They're waiting on this, and now it's gone on to another generation. There are children growing up who've known nothing beyond the sound of a drone overhead their entire lives, and know that at any point their lives or the lives of their family could be extinguished. There was a recent report put out by a human rights group where a child just wanted to go and relieve himself. He came back, and his father asked him about that. Why did you come back so soon? And he said, I was too afraid to go. I was afraid that you might be all killed in a drone strike, and I at least wanted to be with you at the time. So, I mean, this is what people are living with every day, and I think it's not something that most Americans understand about, what a drone war really means to people who are living with it on the ground.
I think it's a really, really good point. And I've covered the Middle East so much. The sound of a drone in the air, if you know what could be coming down upon you when you hear that low hum it's horrifying for any human being, especially as you just described, a child. We caught a really inadvertent glimpse of this in Afghanistan. I was with a colleague, Ben Brody, who brought a drone into Afghanistan, a video drone, not a weaponized drone. We told this small part of the city of Mazar-e-Sharif that we were going to use the drone, and we got kind of permission from Afghan soldiers, from some elders in the community, and we did our best to sort of make sure everyone knew. But still, the sound of lifting that drone up and watching people react to a drone really close overhead for the purposes of video, we realized that the horror, the faces that you saw through that was just something that's not what we were really there to capture yet. That is what stayed with me the most, was how angry it made people, how furious they were that we would even use a drone for video. Lesson learned for us as journalists there was just like, we are not understanding the power of that sound. So, Craig, I'm curious, from your point of view, inside the Afghanistan Papers, how much did you see war planners and the people who were among those 400 who were interviewed for the document? How much do you see them really assessing this strategy of air war, both air strikes and drone strikes, and understanding really the human toll that it takes, and the psychological toll, and all of the other costs that come with it?
I think the questions in the Afghanistan Papers were a little broader. They would assess the strategy. So these were interviews done. They weren't military operational documents or anything like that would assess specific campaigns or air wars. But the bigger question, I mean, we're focused on air wars and air power, but from the military's perspective, they're trying to think, what are our objectives with that? What are we trying to accomplish? And what you would find in different countries, different things. In Pakistan, when the CIA was operating drones, they're looking for specific suspected members of Al-Qaeda or other jihadist groups, and they certainly did kill a number of civilians as well. In Afghanistan, they use drones for different surveillance, as Azmat pointed out, but also for strikes. But really, the question is, over 20 years of war in Afghanistan, or several years of war in Yemen, or in Somalia, or Syria, or Iraq, what are the objectives here that you're using this air power for? Are you just, this is the question that would get raised in the Afghanistan Papers. What are we accomplishing by this? What are we have this target list that started out this big when we invaded Afghanistan. Even though the longer we're there, the target list keeps getting bigger and bigger. There was one interview with the Special Operations General, Edward Reeder. He had deployed to Afghanistan, I think, 7 or 8 times. And he said by the time he went back during the Obama administration, he was a 1 or 2 star general at that point. And he was very blunt. He says, every time we go back, all we're doing is killing people. We're not accomplishing anything. So he wasn't talking about air wars, although he certainly would have been involved in tracking and hunting people down from the air or by helicopter or with raids on the ground. But his point is, what are we accomplishing with this strategy where we come up with these lists of people, whether they're Taliban or Al-Qaeda or other suspected jihadists or people who they're not even certain who they are. That list keeps getting longer. And even though we have these, advanced air-powered weapons at our disposal, what are we really accomplishing with that? And of course, the answer to that is not much after 20 years in Afghanistan. If you look now at the size of the Taliban is estimated to be anywhere from 60 to 70,000 fighters in the Taliban who fight in Afghanistan. And again, Taliban's a fungible definition. A lot of these different groups get lumped in together. But when Obama started his counterinsurgency campaign in 2009, the estimates at that point were there were only about 11 to 15,000 fighters with the Taliban. So since Obama escalated the war in 2009, sent 100,000 troops in, and we've been fighting for another 10 or 11 years since then, even though there's been this incredible amount of air power, whether it's drones or other fighter aircraft, it hasn't accomplished anything. The Taliban's stronger, it's bigger, and the United States' strategic objectives in Afghanistan, which are to try and build up an Afghan government and Afghan security forces that are capable of stabilizing their own country, it hasn't worked. And those are the kind of questions and anguish really that gets expressed in the Afghanistan papers. Is they don't focus on tactics so much as the bigger strategy and the bigger picture and the objectives, which, as most people agree, they haven't been able to meet them.
Neta, how do we, as journalists, make sure we're doing the correct accounting on this war, both, really in all of the facets of the accounting we need to do, financial, moral, the human toll? How do we, as journalists, get better at getting our arms around the full costs of these forever wars, and what could be the basis for those truths to become part of increasing dissent against these wars that really are strategic failures, I would argue, and moral failings quite often. So how do we know we're doing the right accounting, and help us understand how that could be the basis for more concern? I would say we could use the word dissent.
Yeah, I think there's one thing to keep in mind is that truth is the first casualty in war, right? We know that. So we have to have credulity and question the things that we're told at the beginning of any war. I mean, we're always told that the war is going to be fast, it will be effective, that force works, people will back down, and Craig just told us they don't. In fact, they flock to resist. Well, we're told that it's going to be efficient. Lawrence Lindsay in 2002 said the successful prosecution of the Iraq War was going to be good for the U.S. economy. We're always told that war is going to be precise and controllable. And we're told that it's cheaper than the alternatives. And I think that what we have to do is just, I'm a political scientist, and I'm also a student of history, and say, never has any of those things actually been the case. That we tend to, and that decision makers tend to ignore the evidence. So I think as journalists, and I'm not one of you, I don't want to tell you how to do your job, you do a fine job. But as journalists, you have to remember that we've been around the block before, and it's never efficient. People are told in World War I they're going to be home before the leaves fall, or before the snow falls. That's never the case. It's always harder and takes longer. And so that's one thing. And then about the costs, I think that we tend to have a short-term conception of costs, an annual appropriation for the DoD. And if we have a long-term and a comprehensive understanding of the costs, we've got to think about, okay, how are we paying for this? And if it's borrowed, what are the interest costs? And then what are the long tail costs of caring for people who are injured, the tens of thousands of people who suffer injuries, not just from combat, but from carrying their backpacks and from being surrounded by dust. And then think about the long-term costs in the war zone itself, and potentially the cost of cleaning up, either unexploded ordnance or of repairing what you've done. So I think, my caution is, when you hear the sort of rosy analysis, have the courage to ask the question, which is it going to be as quick, effective, controllable, immune from escalation and precise as you say? And then to push for greater transparency. In 2017, we were told that there was about 8,000 troops in Afghanistan. And then it turned out that there were 3,000 more than that. And then last month, we were told that there were 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. And then it turns out that there's 1,000 more than that at least. So we need to have Congress actually help us understand what's going on. Congress hasn't had a good, any accounting of the number of troops since 2017, I think. And I could go on, but I think that those are the main things.
Yeah, Nick.
I think Neta brings up a really important point with transparency. I think, the journalists here, we all know just how difficult it is to try and get at this information. I know the work that Azmat's done, it takes just a tremendous amount of work on the ground and through FOIA requests. Craig talked about how it was 3 years of legal fight to get the Afghanistan Papers. The U.S. military has made it, very difficult for the American people to know what's being done in their name and with their taxpayer dollars. Now, I've covered U.S. Africa Command for more than a decade now, and Craig has done a lot of reporting on it too. It's really exceptional work. AFRICOM has worked exceptionally hard to keep U.S. military operations on the continent hidden, in the shadows. They like to only talk about humanitarian missions, training exercises, and the like. And grudgingly have begun reporting a little bit more on strikes in Somalia, which I don't think AFRICOM actually carries out, in an exact sense. But basically, only when something goes wrong, extremely wrong, like last year when a base in Kenya was overrun by Al-Shabaab fighters, or the 2017 ambush in Tongo, Niger, that killed 4 soldiers. Does news ever really bubble up and a story like that make it to CNN or the front page in the New York Times? Most Americans have no idea that over the last decade, U.S. Special Operations Forces have seen combat in 13 African countries, or that there are 36 named operations and activities in Africa over that time, more than in the greater Middle East. Before Trump pulled U.S. forces out of Somalia last year, there were 29 U.S. bases scattered among 15 different countries in Africa. I think that it's all been kept under wraps, and it's taken a substantial amount of effort to try and expose these things. And when you multiply that across all the geographic combatant commands, Central Command in the Greater Middle East, European Command, Indo-PACOM, Southcom, the scope of the task is it's extremely large, and it's tough even for the great reporters out there to try and grapple with all this, much less get a big picture and explain that in ways that the American public can grapple with.
I think
Thanks,
I just
Azmat.
want to jump in there, because I think part of the problem is also how people are defining war today and how they're conceiving of it. And so when people talk about bringing home troops, many people imagine they're talking about bringing home ground troops from, these numbers stationed in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And that to them is ending war. When in reality, we've spread out the United States has spread out the way it conducts war today. And Nick just gave mention of some of these other bases. But most of the time, the number of people that we have, for example, you look at Qatar or Kuwait or Bahrain and these places where we have tens of thousands of US soldiers, and you then count all of those up, and they're involved in these different air campaigns and different methods of war that we're using and combat. And then you add up, what I think people know very little about, which is also just the US bases where people are also assisting with these wars. And then you add in, and these are not on those books, official books that talk about, the service members involved in the war in Afghanistan, but there are a bunch of contractors where they've started to farm out some of this work as well for air campaigns. This is like a big part of my work, and especially during the pandemic when I couldn't travel abroad as much. I started to learn how much contractors are involved in these air campaigns. You add these numbers up. These are not on the traditional books when we talk about war, but when people talk about bringing home some of these troops and reducing troop numbers, nobody is talking about, bringing home troops from the KAOK at Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That's going to probably become an even bigger hub. It's the one place in the Middle East, one of the only places where the United States can park B-52 bombers. And we now have this very sophisticated system of refueling mid-air. I would really encourage people to go on the Coalition's YouTube channel and look at some of these, just the footage. It's just arresting of these giant aircraft that are just getting refueled in the air so that they can take longer flights. We don't need to have, in many ways, we don't need to have that many troops in Afghanistan, in Iraq. in Yemen and the places that we're talking about in order to continue these wars. In fact, a U.S. military general very recently said before Congress that yes, we intend to still maintain air power over Afghanistan when we are pulling back these troops. That is not something they're going to give up, but it comes back to this idea of how we define war, how many people are defining it as simply as U.S. troops on the ground in that country conducting combat, but we've essentially made it something entirely else that is also less transparent, less accessible, and is not being counted, and maybe also is seen as less of a political threat, like when we talk about the political costs of wars, because they often don't involve U.S. service member deaths as well. These are safe.
Thanks.
These are often very safe deployments.
Yeah, I think that notion of this sprawling enterprise of contractors and the intensity of that and the costs of that and the vulnerability of those contractors as U.S. military troops pull out of Afghanistan is a big part of what we'll all be watching going forward, as well as the vulnerability of the population to the Taliban. It is such a balancing here. I thought some of the reporting you did, Azmat, around girls' schools was extraordinary. It was really interesting, the ghost schools, the sort of ways in which there's promises made through aid of work that we're doing that are also they're also pretty deceptive, and that are not there's a lot of good work for us to do there. But Craig, I want to shift in a moment, but I wanted to give you a chance maybe just to talk about, just to conclude this section around, like, what do we need to do better in terms of accounting in the wars that exist now, these forever wars that you're covering in a lot of different places. What did you learn from the Afghanistan papers about ways that we need to look more carefully at the costs of war?
Well, I'd echo Nick a little bit. It isn't that journalists aren't asking these questions and they aren't demanding accountability. It's just getting answers, and correct answers, accurate, truthful answers, can be really difficult when you get at some of these hard questions about impact of military operations, about civilians being killed, but also the bigger strategic questions. Why are we there? What are we trying to accomplish? Journalists ask these questions, but getting the honest truth is very difficult. I'll give you an example. When George Bush announced the start of the war in Afghanistan in October 2001, he held a primetime news conference 4 days after the bombing started. And one of the first questions he got was, how long do you think this war is going to go on? Do you think we might get stuck like we did in Vietnam? Right. So this is a question right off the bat. It wasn't that people didn't ask. And he was cagey, right? He didn't promise that they would be home by Christmas. He didn't promise that the war was going to be over anytime soon. But he was a little vague about it. He says, we have to be patient. This war could take a long time. I can't say whether it'll be weeks or months and maybe even years. But he said, but we learned our lesson in Vietnam. And the lesson we learned is that you can't fight a guerrilla force with conventional military forces. That was the lesson Bush was talking about, that we don't want to get stuck in fighting in an insurgency with our regular military forces. And that certainly is a lesson to draw from Vietnam, but they didn't learn it in Afghanistan, right? We got stuck in an even longer guerrilla war, an insurgency that got worse and worse. And so even the people in charge at the White House and the Pentagon, they knew we didn't, Rumsfeld, Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary in the Bush administration, every time he'd get asked about, are we going to get stuck? Is it going to be like Vietnam? Is it going to be a quagmire? Rumsfeld would mock people who would ask this. He'd laugh at them and he'd say, quagmire, we're not in a quagmire. This isn't Vietnam. We're doing great. We're in control. But of course, in what the Afghanistan paper showed is we also got Donald Rumsfeld's memos. These, most of them were classified internal memos called snowflakes. He wrote so many of them, the staff would talk about Rumsfeld's memos settling on their desks like snow. And Rumsfeld would say one thing in public. He'd say, the war is going great, we're accomplishing everything. And on the same day or the same week, he'd write a memo, a snowflake, to his generals saying, I'm really worried about the war, we're drifting, or we're never going to get the troops out of there. I mean, so they'll say one thing in public sometimes and then the exact opposite in private. Now, how do you report that in real time? That's really hard unless you have somebody who's leaking it to you, like a whistleblower, or you have unbelievable sources in positions of power, or sometimes it just takes many years till you really get at the truth, and that's really hard. So I don't have an easy answer for you on how we get to the truth and how we hold people accountable in real time, except to keep asking questions, never settle for the answers you're given, always try and verify it, always look for more angles where you can dig deeper and further and try and verify. But you have to use all of these tools. We need whistleblowers, we need FOIA, we need people on the ground, we need to talk to, I mean, the work Azmat did with civilians and the casualties, that's extraordinarily difficult and risky reporting to do in a live war zone. But journalists do this, but we just got to keep at it, I guess, is the short answer.
Proposed book title, Snow Job, the Donald Rumsfeld in Afghanistan. Nick, did you have something you want to add? I want to go into the role of whistleblowers next, but do you have something that can help us close out this section?
Well, maybe it helps us open up the whistleblower part because, Craig talking about, what's being said in public as opposed to, what these folks are saying in private. It reminded me of, a general that I spoke with who he actually presided over a series of papers that I found in the U.S. National Archives. It was tens of thousands of pages of investigations of U.S. war crimes in Vietnam. And the Pentagon used these as an early warning system at the time. They didn't want to be caught flat-footed by another My Lai, by a massacre scandal. So it was his job to keep an eye on investigations, and then they also used these, as a way to go out in the field and tamp down, possible scandals that were coming. And I talked to him during the Iraq War about this, and he told me, I wish I had had the moral courage at the time. If I had come out with these papers at the time, if I had brought them forward, if the Pentagon had been honest, then maybe we wouldn't have the Abu Ghraib scandal, which had just broken at that time. And I think it takes it takes real courage. It's something that he said that he lacked at the time, wished that he had. But that's what it takes. That's what we need. People that are willing to come forward, even at great cost to themselves.
Thanks, Nick. I also think the work you did looking back in history at My Lai and excavating the war in Vietnam through documents that had never been revealed. Like, we have a lot of work to do because now we're at 20 years of America's longest war in Afghanistan. There's so much more work to do and going back to the things that we know went wrong and staying with it. I mean, I think you proved that, Nick, that's a really valuable thing to bring home the history so that it can inform the present. I want to shift for a moment to the role of the whistleblower. And I just want to be mindful of what we are honoring here, which is the 50-year anniversary of Dan Ellsberg releasing the Pentagon Papers. First the New York Times, then the Washington Post. Ultimately, I think it was 17 papers across the country who all violated the prior restraint order in order to put the word out about the lies, the deceptions that have been told through 4 administrations. And it really is so important on this anniversary and to honor Dan Ellsberg's legacy for us as journalists to think about, what role do whistleblowers play in getting at the truth on the war? Are you all informed by whistleblowers? Do they have the same power that they did before? I just want to kind of get in to sort of geek out a little bit as journalists around whistleblowers, around how that's informed your work and how you've managed to use people inside at a high level or even at a lower level to get documents that shaped your reporting. And also, Neta, I'd love to hear from you and your really important groundbreaking work on the costs of war. how do you get inside of the administration or inside of the Pentagon to get deeper and deeper down into the truth? So maybe we'll start with you, Neta, and then come to the journalists after that.
Okay, well, look, what I do, and I've done this now almost 40 years, is I try to use publicly available information when I'm doing work so that people can check my work. If I'm telling you a number, I want you to be able to go look it up yourself. But I have benefited from work that came out, for instance, when Assange published the non-combatant cutoff value of 30, which is it's the number that the United States was willing to of civilians above which you had to ask for permission so that you could wage an airstrike. If you were putting more than 30 people at risk, you needed the president or the Secretary of Defense to say yes. That number was not public until it was published by WikiLeaks. And other numbers have come out. That particular number is important because it tells you the value of life that the Bush administration put in the early months of the Iraq War. So yes, that it's informed my work, but my goal is to push for greater transparency and to get Congress to push for more accurate and timely information. And I think if I could say anything, Congress needs to be digging more, and they make it possible through work by requesting from the Congressional Research Service or even CIGAR, requesting and getting answers to questions. And then when you read in, when I did my work on Pentagon greenhouse gases, there is no way to get an assessment from the Pentagon of their carbon emissions. They don't tell you. And they're in their documents, they say, do not tell Congress how much fuel we're buying and using. That's explicit. Don't give this information. So I think we need to have the help of the people's representatives at this juncture.
Thanks, Neta. I feel like we live in this time when truth is really under attack, right? From every possible angle. There's this weaponization of doubt. There's everyone seems to be, especially in the last administration, there was a real effort to demonize truth tellers, to call journalists enemies of the people. But it's never been more important for us to get there, to really keep fighting for these truths. So I want to just ask all of you, and maybe start with you, Craig, just sort of what does the battle look like on the ground to get at truth in a time when it feels like it is harder than ever to pull them forward? And when you find them, how does it resonate, or how does it not resonate? And how do you deal with that?
It's a really good question, and it's a tough question. I think most reporters, they try and get the information any which way they can, right? Whether it's whistleblowers, sources, you want to make it easy for people to tell you information that you don't know about. So most news organizations these days, they have on their websites, they have a secure way to drop documents. We have tip lines, things like that, all designed to protect the anonymity of tipsters. And we get flooded with information, and we have to verify it, of course, because most of it, isn't necessarily newsworthy. But every once in a while, you get a nugget in there, and you're able to get onto a great story. But you bring up an interesting point about the role of whistleblowers and how you can use them over time to redefine history. I just finished up a book on the Afghanistan Papers that the Post is going to publish in August, and we've gone beyond the original cache of documents we had, and we're able to acquire hundreds of oral history interviews that the Army had done with their own soldiers coming back, which are really ripe with these very frank acknowledgments of what went wrong in the war. But one thing I kept turning to time and again were the WikiLeaks diplomatic cables that Chelsea Manning had obtained, and WikiLeaks posted that's been 10 years ago now, right? But there were so many, and I remember reporting on those at the time, but there's such a historical resource that ordinarily would take 10, 15, 20, 25 years till they're declassified. But even today, in writing this book on Afghanistan, I'll give you an example. We talk about what officials say in public versus what they say in private. You can really line things up sometimes with these cables, these diplomatic notes. There was, back in 2006, the war was not going well in Afghanistan for the United States. The Taliban was really starting to make a comeback. There were a lot of suicide attacks. Things were not going well, but in public, the generals kept saying, we're making progress, we're making progress. It's just, the Taliban's last gasp of, they're desperate to show that they're relevant, but believe it or not, we're winning. Well, there was one interview on 9/11/2006 that a three-star general, Carl Eikenberry, gave to ABC News, where he said, we're winning the war. Even though the context was everybody knew the Taliban was really on the increase. Well, in the WikiLeaks cables, we found a classified cable from the ambassador at the time, who sent a cable back to Washington, as well as to the Pentagon. This was days before General Eikenberry said, we're winning. The US ambassador said, we're not winning. Literally, I'm quoting, he said, we're not winning. So they're literally saying the opposite in private is what they're saying in public. But, that's a perfect example for you, Charlie, about, I wouldn't have been able to put this in the book had it not been for WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning obtaining that information. We would have had to wait another 10 or 15 or 20 years for those cables to be declassified.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. It is an incredible journey to try to get at truth these days. It somehow seems harder than ever. But Nick and Azmat, I'm just curious, maybe each of you share some sense of your own strategies for getting at these truths that we have to keep going at. We have to keep doing it. Azmat, your work, especially use of data, has been just so extraordinary. Can you share a little bit about some of the challenges you face, how you're getting at these deeper truths, and what do we need to do more of?
These are great questions, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. In my case, I do try to approach things from as many different ways as possible to have the maximum amount of evidence as possible. So that does mean, yes, I go on the ground and I interview people and I collect data on the ground. But I also do as much as I can, for example, with the US military. And that isn't just, doing an embed at the KAOC in Qatar, or, speaking to service members on the ground. It's, filing lots of FOIA requests. I'm in the middle of it's been 3 years since I filed it, a lawsuit against the Department of Defense for its own civilian casualty records, which I've been getting. And this is the largest cache of civilian casualty data possessed by anyone outside of the US military in these most recent wars, and going through it. And I've been struck at, sometimes they're gold mines. They're filled with amazing content. And then sometimes it's a 137-page investigation that I have been given 5 pages of, and those 5 pages are heavily redacted. And so in those circumstances, of course, I'm also still, also talking to people, and I want to be careful about what I say. But I think I've been so surprised by how often people have contacted me or sought me out to give me things. And the level of difference when I have those, when they're completely unredacted, is just monumental. They have made, sometimes I can't disclose that, and for their safety, it becomes the lead that allows me to pursue something. Sometimes, they actually want to be, they want to be able to come forward, and it's fascinating to kind of grapple with, safety and thinking through what the consequences might be for them. And in those cases where I've been able to get that, there's, I think, layers. You'd mentioned, Charlie, that sometimes they're high level, sometimes they're low level, and in each they can be so valuable, right? There's a set of documents that are unredacted right now that I have that are incredibly, I don't know how to put it except to say that I wouldn't be able to do that investigation that I'm doing without them. And that was the result of some people. And so, I think that the best reporters, people here are approaching things from multiple angles. They're doing it from the ground. They're doing it, in the public record. They're doing it behind the scenes. And they're also respecting the safety of their sources and preserving, what I think the legacy of what we've been talking about here in this conference has done so well. But I think that it would be naive to assume that any one of these things is superior to than the others. I think that, it really takes a concerted effort. The one thing I do want to say is that, a great frustration of mine when it comes to journalists in the post 9/11 era is that we have too often ceded to the justifications of the government that on national security grounds, we cannot provide you X, Y, or Z, and allowed them the authority to say, well, we can't tell you X, we can't show you the evidence of X, but we can say that this person is, a major terrorist cell leader. And at the same time, as journalists, we are required to go and interview people on the ground and talk to them and have them produce a very high level of evidence that this person on the ground never gets to say, I'm sorry, this is my personal privacy. I'm not going to open up my entire life to you and allow you to dissect it and look for any evidence that I'm guilty. And if you find, it's not enough to just for me to be this person, I have to prove my innocence. And the thing that I found that really I find so fascinating is that in the cases where I've been able to get things unredacted, or I find out the intelligence that the government had, in many cases, I found that the threshold for the level of intelligence, let's say it's here for a certain airstrike, for that person in that airstrike to then get their names cleared is so much higher. The things they had to prove is just vastly higher. And that to me is one of the things that I think so many journalists have done wrong, which is that we have ceded that kind of, well, you're not telling us what intelligence you have. We're not really in the position, we can't really do anything except to report what you say we don't know that that's necessarily true, present this other information and move along. And I really think that if the United States government is going to justify, the killing of individuals on evidence that they keep secret in mass, to the extent that they do, of course, there are instances in which that's important, then of course there are going to be leakers. Then of course there are going to be people who are going to try to make sense of that and provide that insight to journalists in different scenarios and circumstances. And I just wish that journalists have had a better way, myself included, a better way of how to deal with those scenarios in which we are told, no, you can't have this. We can't tell you why. Just know that it's true.
So what is the better way? Like I'm trying to get my head around what is the better way? How do we do that?
I'm not saying threaten not to report it and say we won't use what you said unless you provide us the evidence of that. But all too often there is this kind of refusal to, and then as journalists, we wind up, and I say this with a great amount of, this is the part of my job that I hate the most, is going to these civilians and picking apart their life to make sure that there is no evidence that they did X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm. And they have to open themselves up. I mean, I don't do it unless they're willing to be participants in that. And, they want to be counted as civilians. And that's what they say they are. But do you see what I'm saying is that it puts the onus on them to prove their innocence. They're guilty unless, you can show that they're not. And you never get a chance to answer. They never get a chance to answer what they're accused of. And that to me feels profoundly unjust. And then journalists are perpetuating that in a way that I just really wish I didn't have to. In a fact check, those civilians, they have to meet such a high standard for me to write about them. And yet the government, for me to include what they claim to be true, it doesn't get that same level of scrutiny simply because there is a mismatch of power there.
So fairness in interrogation of all sources, whether they're military or civilians. Nick, what are you seeing on the ground in terms of these I want to really hear about strategies for truth. I think Dan Ellsberg's legacy is that he makes a conscious choice at some point to begin a campaign for truth about the war. And he kind of sets out on that. He's not a journalist, of course, but he knew the power of working with journalists to get those truths out. Are we as available? Are we as open to that kind of transformative truth telling that happened with the Pentagon Papers? Do you feel like in your strategies, are you thinking big like that? Are there others out there who have the documents and who have those truths? What kind of confidence do you have that we can honor Dan's legacy by continuing to dig, going hard for truths? And what are some of the strategies you bring to doing that?
Very good question. I think there are people out there. And No, but I think it's becoming more and more difficult, for journalists to protect the people that are out there. I wrote several stories from the Snowden papers, and I worked on a project called the drone papers at the Intercept with some top secret leaked documents that offer an unprecedented window into a lot of different things. But I'm very cognizant of the fact that the leaker of the drone papers, Daniel Hale, is now facing 10 years in prison. And as we know, Edward Snowden's been trapped in Russia for years. We talked about Chelsea Manning. I don't know if we mentioned Reality Winner, but there've been a lot of whistleblowers who've risked a lot in these years, and it's been successive American administrations that have been waging a war on whistleblowers and succeeding where the Nixon administration failed with Dan Ellsberg. I think it's more imperative than ever to protect sources, and it's becoming more difficult. I especially worry about my sources overseas living under oppressive regimes. They're risking more than their station or their livelihood when they come forward to talk with me. They're risking imprisonment or death in many cases, and they're so brave and they bear such a huge cost. I think it's important to keep that in mind, but I think they're living their lives in the spirit of Dan Ellsberg, in the spirit that we need truth and dissent, and it's the only way that we can get at how this world really works.
Thanks, Nick. That is a perfect segue into what I want to use as sort of a concluding strategy here of hearing from each of you on exactly what Nick was just saying, which is let's go back to truth, dissent, and the legacy of Dan Ellsberg. And before I go there, I want to do a little programming note. I'm seeing in the chat that there are some questions around maybe glitches in some of the transmission. If that's the case, I apologize. For those of you who can hear clearly, we'll look into that. We're certainly going to have a recording of this that I hope will be a clean recording. So if you missed a part because there was a glitch, hopefully we'll be able to capture that through the recording. And there are some other questions that are happening in the chat that we'll try to get at. Maybe get back to some of those of you who are asking them, just to share that, because I can see in the chat they're asking me, is anyone following the chat? And my short answer is I'm doing my best. The thing that I would love, though, to come now in a sort of concluding round of just thoughts from each of you about truth, dissent, and the legacy of Daniel Ellsberg. How are you thinking about that? What concluding notes would you want to have for this conference? And I think maybe we'll just go around the horn and hear from each of you. And Craig, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I think that's a great question. How do you get at the truth? And these days, establishing the truth and who defines it and verifying it to people's satisfaction is really, really hard. To this day, there's a large percentage of people in America who think that Donald Trump won the last presidential election. We're still fighting that battle over truth and fact. So how do you establish the truth in matters of war? There's one hopeful sign that I'd like to raise that we haven't talked about so far, but it's the use of omnipresent video and social media that helps reporters establish what happened in faraway places where they weren't able to be on the scene. Nowadays, the explosion in video, people having their cell phones, being able to post things immediately, it brings real advantages, but also challenges in trying to establish the truth of what happened. There can be fakes, there can be people edit things, but it can also really give you insights into what happened in an event. And I'd just like you to think about for a minute, it's been 10 years since the raid in Pakistan that killed Osama bin Laden, right? And you think if that had happened today, when the Navy SEALs went in on a few helicopters into Abbottabad in Pakistan, which is a pretty substantial city, there was a crowd that gathered while the SEALs were there in the compound for about 45 minutes. They knew there was something going on, but back then, you didn't have smartphones in abundance in Pakistan. But if today you had that, everybody'd be out there doing this with the SEALs, right? And there'd be video of like the whole operation. And then the challenge would be, while this is unfolding in real time, what is it? What's going on? How do you verify it? How do you get the rights of the video? So, that changes the whole equation in some ways when you're trying to do reporting. It can really give you the truth of what's going on, but really trying to establish what it means and what's authentic and what's not, it brings its own set of challenges. But, I think about the work Azmat does with civilian casualties. It's one thing to go in and interview people and, days, months, weeks, years after the fact and go by their memories. That's hard enough. But now if you also have video clips to go with it, or people took photos, and that's much more accessible. And we've seen this in Syria to a large degree, where Western journalists haven't been able to go into Syria, yet we rely on video clips or photographs taken by people on the ground. Gives us, it's a tool to find out the truth of what's going on, but it's tough too to establish what's real and what's not.
It's like the globalization of Darnella Fraser. Like, how do you get a lot of points of view out there? Darnella Fraser, I believe I have that name right. She was the young girl really, who shot the video of the murder of George Floyd. And I think that sense of there are millions of whistleblowers out there in the world who can capture things that are happening in real time and who can share them with us and who can bring truths forward. And that may be one of the great democratizations of truth that's happening in real time. The sad part of all that is it creates a landscape where it often feels like truth begins to almost pixelate and fall apart. And I don't have answers to this. I think as journalists, we're in a sort of in a tough terrain on that. Azmat, do you have any thoughts, reflections on these themes: truth, dissent, and the legacy of Daniel Ellsberg?
Yes, I mean, I think that it is, when we talk about how to get to truth and to understand things, I constantly find that I'm learning like deeper and deeper layers of things and why they're happening. I think that that's been really fascinating for me, is that it's not as much as just here, this is happening, here's a reality on the ground, but digging more deeply into why something is happening is important to me in my work. And, I teach journalism, I teach conflict reporting to students about how to go into war zones, how to do this kind of reporting. And I think some of the things that I focus on are that it's not just about looking at the scenes around you and calculating data. It's about understanding local and historical context. And often that can help you also understand whys of certain things, why particular things are happening, whether that's on the ground in the place that you're looking at, and yields a level of truth you wouldn't have otherwise. I think that it's a meaningful part of this. Investigative journalism is, of course, doing that deep digging, the interviewing. I look for, I use satellite imagery to map these places and understand what changes have taken place. And if there were, airstrikes here, I do scour local news and social media that's come out of Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan for some of these strikes. But nothing on the internet can replace the value of that kind of harder, deeper understanding history.
Azmat, I think we just
died. Sorry.
But, okay, go ahead.
But essentially, it comes down to local and historical context and that sort of deeper taking of these people and these individuals and understanding the systems that are at play. So it's the intersection of this very local dynamic and these individuals with these larger systems of power. And that yields a level of truth I don't think we would have otherwise.
Thanks, Azmat. And just another programming note, I've just been assured by our technicians at UMass that we do have clean recordings of all of the conversations. So even if you did have a glitch of some kind, interrupted the streaming, we will be able to share the recordings on our website that we've built. So just know, we apologize if you did have a glitch. I'm hearing some people had no problem and some seem to have. So for any of you who did, we hope we can correct that, because this is a really important conversation. I wouldn't want anyone to miss a minute. Nick, you already offered a really strong reflection on this, but anything you'd want to add before we have Neta offer sort of a closing thought on those themes of truth, dissent, and the legacy of Daniel Ellsberg?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's easy to get sort of depressed or resigned to that it's more and more difficult to get things out there. But I think it's important to keep in mind that history isn't on a linear path, and that it moves sideways in many ways. And if this last year is taught us anything, it's that you can't see what's coming. You just don't know. And I'm heartened by the work that Neta does, Craig's disclosures, Azmat's reporting. It gives me hope, that putting the truth out there can inspire real change. You just don't know when or where it's going to come from, but that's that's how it works. The work that we do, putting it all out there, you just can't know, but eventually, I think it really pays dividends.
Thanks, Nick. The work we do at GroundTruth is to support a new generation, emerging journalists, as we say, to work in undercovered corners of the world and to really get at these truths. And I really love the way you give hope to that spirit, that there is this coming generation that really, I think, is committed to the work, committed to the service of journalism. And thanks for being hopeful about it. Too much of our tribe, we're all talking about the death of journalism and how great it used to be. First of all, I don't think it was that great in the past. As someone who has a long history in the past, I think we can be better, and we will be better. And I love that the three journalists here are all doing such great work and really setting an example for the next generation to take up that mantle and to keep doing it. But Neta, I think it's so appropriate that since we journalists always get to have like the last word, that we go to our colleague as an academic, as a researcher, as someone who's done extraordinary truth-telling of your own through really hard work, give you the last word sort of on the reflection of that theme of the whole conference, truth, dissent, and the legacy of Daniel Ellsberg.
I think it's natural that you, as journalists, have focused on truth, but I want to focus on dissent in just a moment here. One of the things that's a parallel between Vietnam and today is the lack of official dissent and the lack of questioning, and the fact that the snowflake memos are not echoed, and people are not questioning internally. And the same thing happened in Vietnam. George Ball was very questioning of the Vietnam War. He's gone, right? He's pushed out. He's basically called a wuss. It's because he's too weak. So I think that dissent is very difficult to do inside, and certainly if people are echoed or affirmed outside, that helps them. But one of the things I wanted to think about was what Ryan Crocker says in the Afghanistan Papers. He says, and I'm going to quote him, I hope you'll come up with a list of questions policymakers should be asking before they launch the next major incursions. And I found that statement really interesting for a number of reasons. First, it was that his entire interview and that statement are an indication of how little policymakers were prepared for what they got into, and how little they listened to the evidence that they got that it wasn't going well. In other words, confirmation bias. Everything that they could possibly spin into something good, they spun it to something good. And groupthink, the inability to question. Second, we already have a list of questions that journalists and the public can ask, and they're found either in the just war tradition that says, is this last resort proportional, necessary? Do we have the right intention? And it's also found in public policy school. What are the costs and risks, not just the benefits that you want to focus on for any one policy? And then finally, he's asking us to that statements about policymakers, but really it's all of us, right, who have the potential for critical thinking and dissent using history, what we know about past wars, because wars actually don't change that much. I do think the means change, but not so much the methods. I'm sorry, the aims and the deeper strategy. So that we have the responsibility for members of Congress and as citizens to dissent, to protest. For in the early 2000s, there was this responsibility to protect. We have a responsibility to protest. And we haven't, there was a lot of discussion earlier in the conference about the various people who were beaten up by the police when they protested or arrested in the Vietnam War, or people who went to jail like Randy Keeler for standing up for their convictions. We have a responsibility to protest and to fight ordinances, laws that would make it difficult for us to protest legally. So I believe that the legacy of Dan Ellsberg is as much in dissent as it is, and fostering ways for us to think about how to dissent and the importance of internal dissent as it is in truth.
Thanks, Neta. I think maybe as journalists, I feel like the thing that we come down on is the idea I've learned from having a wonderful year with Dan Ellsberg is truth is dissent. That's sort of my true north from having a wonderful opportunity to be with Dan. I want to really thank you all. Thank you to the panel. We just have a few more minutes, and I'm going to offer some thank yous and some concluding thoughts. But I really want to say thank you so much to Nick, Craig, to Neta, to Azmat. Thanks so much. Great discussion. Great way to close out the conference. Thank you. I want to say some thank yous here because we had chances in this conference to have long conversations, thoughtful conversations. I felt like they could breathe, and that's so unusual these days when conferences move at a clip where you don't really get to do that. So that means that we had the right support for this, and that begins with a thank you to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Happens to be my alma mater. Very proud of the university, and I'm very grateful to Chancellor Subbaswamy for real leadership, a commitment to truth in organizing this year-long public history project. And I just want to say, for all of you who are listening to the end here, it doesn't end today. All of these panels are up on the webpage that we've built in this partnership with GroundTruth and the University of Massachusetts. We've built a timeline. We've built ways for you to explore the archive through the amazing collection that has been acquired by UMass of Dan Ellsberg's papers. 500 boxes of all of his papers are now in the library at UMass, and they are going to be unfolding as they organize the archive over the next few years. I hope our website will stand as a place where you can learn about that. You can keep coming back to that. I also wanted to just talk about our podcast. A big part of the Public History Project is a 5-episode podcast. It's titled The Whistleblower. It's a GroundTruth podcast, and this season is called The Whistleblower. So wherever you get your podcasts, Stitcher, Apple, iTunes, whatever, it's the GroundTruth podcast, and the season is The Whistleblower. And we just dropped our 2nd episode, and we'll be going an episode every 2 weeks right up to June 13th. Which is the official 50th anniversary, the day that marks the New York Times publication of the Pentagon Papers. So please follow that podcast. Please share it with others and subscribe, because if you subscribe, you're going to be reminded when the new ones come out. I want to say thanks to Professor Christian Oppie, who is a history professor. I am a graduate of the history department. He's an amazing academic, an amazing talent. He was our lead academic advisor on this, and thank you, Chris, for your leadership. Professor Kathy Ford of the journalism program also provided tremendous leadership on this, and all three of us have had a chance to see the amazing work of the students at UMass in our seminar. These are really exceptional students. They began the whole conference, and their insights into Dan Ellsberg's legacy and his life are extraordinary. And I love the fact that we're seeing Dan Ellsberg now through these eyes of a new generation and seeing that importance of truth and dissent. And most of all, I guess I just want to thank all of you who attended. I want to thank all of the participants in the panels And most of all, I want to thank Dan Ellsberg. Really, truly want to thank him for his service to our country, and thank him for his truth-telling. He has an enduring legacy, and it is about truth and dissent. Thank you all for coming.